Hello, Professor Kent Lee here. In this video, I'm going to actually go through the article that was assigned for you to look at, the research article, and then a couple of other research articles, and talk about their structure for you. You were to have done an assignment in which you looked at the research article, the sociology article, and maybe find one of your own. So I'm going to go through and, the sociology article first, and then I'll go through an applied linguistics education research article, and then a literature research article. So first, the sociology article. It's called "A World of Difference International Trends in Women's Economic Status." And I picked it because it's kind of a light quantitative article. It's kind of quantitative, but it's sort of light in a way compared to others. And of course, it's kind of relevant because a lot of female students take this class, and a lot of, female students from the English department will probably go into jobs in business careers or a range of careers, from airlines to classroom teaching to professional careers. So I think this is kind of relevant. And as a linguist, I'm interested in social issues like this kind of. So we look at this article. Again, if you had trouble, you should have been able to download it, especially if you're on the Pugende campus and like if you're using the Chrome browser, for example, it should recognize that you're on campus and should be able to access it through the library, or at least you can go to the journal website and download the HTML version of the article if the PDF isn't available to you. So as you look at the article, okay, you got the title. Here's the single author and keywords. So a lot of times the keywords are important if you're doing a Google Scholar search for keywords. Authors know this, so they try to put in relevant keywords so that their articles will get found. Abstract. So it's a nice summary. I'll go ahead and look through the abstract. It talks about around the globe in the affluent West, women have made strides toward equality, while access to major institutions has equalized or become equal dramatically. Participation in labor markets, the workforce education system often comes in the form of gender differentiated roles within these institutions. So that is, while more women are entering higher education, the workforce, and such, there is still sort of this gender differentiation. That is, women tending to enter or get placed into certain jobs, as the article will discuss. There are more women in, say, certain jobs in like education and healthcare, service industries, and certain majors in college and graduate school. So the article, as it says here, reviews international trends, and that's kind of a key word. This is not so much an original quantitative study, but it's more of a review article. So we talked about different genres of articles. It could be like an original empirical study, a theoretical study, but this is a review article. So it's actually critiquing and discussing and assessing various published studies on the specific topic to review and look for, in this case, trends. What are some particular trends that are happening? As you look at the different research, okay, what can we glean from the different empirical studies out there and from the data? What can we glean in terms of patterns in women's status in, for example, the workforce, labor markets and such? So it's a review article. It's trying to draw from different studies to find some more general or holistic conclusions, rather than conducting an original empirical study. So it reviews international trends at different indicators of women's economic status. And this is key. This is kind of a strength of the article. It's looking at a number of different indicators from different kinds of studies: women in the US, women in other Western countries, developing countries, and so on. And the abstract says forms of equality tend to persist in advanced industrial societies, or those that are readily interpreted as outcomes as free choices by formally equal but innately different men and women. Okay, that's a little complicated. As we'll unpack it later, or get to see later, I think there may be some weaknesses in how the author maybe developed that point. It's like women have access to all these opportunities, but they're still tending to prefer certain choices, certain female-dominated majors or career paths. So is it a matter of culture and society kind of directing them, still pushing them in those directions due to cultural stereotypes, or is it just their own choice? Are they choosing it? They're formally equal. Is it they are innately different? Well, I think the author doesn't really try to deal with innate differences so much, but there seem to be reasons why they may still be preferring certain career paths. So let's get into the article itself, introduction. So it starts with some kind of historical background. Now, the introduction is background to the topic, but notice that the way this is written, it's not written for an average audience. Yet we all know about, in general, women have been increasingly employed in the job market, since the 20th century. The writer does not insult our intelligence. The writer assumes that we are intelligent, and the writer actually gives fairly more specific, detailed explanation. It's still fairly in general terms. So, for example, complete inequality talks about gender differences in schools and workplaces and such. So it's it is a somewhat general historical overview of these changes in society, but it's stated in a more specific and intelligent way. Historical and sociological description of the general way that women have been gaining in increasing their numbers in the workforce and in higher education. And in the second paragraph, it starts talking about different sociological, historical analyses and models and such, cite sources for some of these models and such. And so it's fairly sophisticated presentation of the general trend of women and their increasing presence in society. All right, so the next sections or so are sort of like, it doesn't say literature review, but it is sort of like an extended literature review, somewhat of a detailed literature review, the next couple of sections. Theories of evolutionary change. So what the writer is doing is talking about theoretical background. So the writer is a sociologist. And so the writer is talking about different theoretical explanations for why some kinds of inequality might still exist, as well as the general trend for greater equality. Well, the fact that generally women have been entering, higher education in the workforce more and more, and specific sociological explanations for this. Yeah, we all know about feminism and equal rights movements and so. Okay, that's obvious. But from a sociological standpoint, what we're interested in, what the author is interested in, is how do you explain, apart from political movements and such, how is it that women have increased their numbers in the workforce, and then later on, why do we see certain inequalities? One is sort of an economic efficiency model the writer first talks about, and here on page 356. And that companies find it more economically efficient to hire more women, especially as there is more demand for employing women and for employment. And the second one is a sort of an independent causal force, which gets a little more theoretical. The fact that values are changing globally and in international companies and organizations and such. And so companies are just naturally responding to social changes and social movements by employing more women. Kind of similar ideas, actually, but it would lead to slightly different predictions, I think, when you look at some of the data. So in the first model, it's just that discrimination becomes more costly as a society becomes not only more socially progressive, but economically developed. It's more costly to discriminate, and it's actually more efficient economically to extend, full employment equality to women. In the second view, it's just responding to changes in social attitudes and social pressures. Kind of similar, but it might lead to slightly different predictions when you look at the data. Then it goes on to looking more into some of the historical background, historical trends in this sort of that would support this kind of view. Then on 357, despite the speed of these kinds of trends, egalitarian trends, egalitarian meaning equal, social equality, being treated equally, in labor markets, education, and households, women still concentrate in female type occupations and work. And that's kind of the problem that the writer is introducing, that's kind of a problem. You have these general international trends where women are gaining more equality, yet despite their greater access to jobs, education, employment, there is still a sort of inequality in that for some reason they are ending up more so in certain kinds of majors or careers and still doing more household work at home, like cleaning, laundry, taking care of kids and such. They haven't really achieved enough equality when it comes to the share of household work, in families. The next section, International Trends in Women's Economic Status, starts looking at the economic aspects. And so it begins by defining inequality. It's at the beginning of this section, page 357. There's a definition of inequality, and this is important. Inequality is somewhat of a general, vague concept. And in order to study something, you need to define it in a very specific way. There are different ways you could define inequality. In order to study something in academic research, you need to define it in a certain way, a lot of terms. If you're doing psychology, you need to define happiness in a very specific way that can be studied. Sometimes this is called operationalization. That's a fancy term for providing a specific technical definition to something so that you can study it, you can do research on it, especially if you want to do empirical research on something like equality, discrimination. You need a very specific scientific or technical definition that allows you to study it. It allows you to collect data on it and compare the data and analyze the data based on a very specific definition. Otherwise, if you just take inequality in a more general, colloquial sense, people could argue about what it means and such. So researchers will sometimes define terms in a very specific way in their papers. And so there's a very specific economic definition in terms of differences in men's and women's economic outcomes and so on. There's a fairly detailed definition. And thus in the process, it's talking about gender gaps between men and women, where women don't have equality. So this little section then says, based on primary different sources, we're going to look at this. Then there's a subsection, degendering of access. So it again talks about, for example, in labor and education, women have greater access. And goes on to specific areas, educational attainment on page 358, educational attainment. 358, 359, labor force participation. So here, and notice throughout sources are cited. Sources are cited regarding the different models and theories that are discussed and used. Sources are cited for some of the claims, even so far, about changes in women's economic status, equality, participation in the workforce and such, and some of the problems. Here, this gets into much more specific detail. So here, the author is reviewing and citing a lot of studies. So for example, educational attainment. The author cites and discusses a lot of studies showing that women have achieved much greater access to higher education, college education, postgraduate or graduate education like master's and PhD programs. But at the same time, they have tended towards more towards certain majors, education and healthcare, things that are more female or associated with or considered female kinds of majors, and not as much towards, engineering and stuff. Although it doesn't go into a lot of detail about some of those disparities. It talks about this within the US, OECD, Western nations, and a little bit about developing countries too. Next section, labor force participation. And again, there's a lot of sources cited. The writer discusses and summarizes a lot of research by organizations and researchers, economic data and such, showing in the US, Western countries, OECD countries, and to some degree in developing countries, women have gained, a lot more access to the workforce. A lot more women have entered the workforce, in recent decades, in various countries, even whether it's beginning positions, managerial positions, professional positions, non-professional positions, service work and such. But there is a disproportionate number of women going into certain careers. Why is it? That's kind of discussed a little bit later on. But women will tend to go more into service fields, service sectors, education, teaching, healthcare, again. Certain kinds of jobs that women really tend more towards. So even though women have much better representation in the workforce, perhaps almost as good as men, there is quite a bit of disparity when you consider specific kinds of occupations. To some degree, this has happened in developing countries as they try to imitate Western countries by allowing more women into the workforce, yet there are these gender gaps when it comes to particular occupations. Next section talks about wages, disparities in wages between men and women. Next section, the resilience of sex segregation. That is, and here it begins with, for example, sex segregation in households. So economic, sociological studies showing that women are still doing, even though they are formally equal in their societies in, say, developed countries, they are still doing more housework than the men are. More female jobs. Again, sex segregation in labor markets. Yeah, so this is actually where it goes more into detail and cites studies showing that women are more segregated in according to like service jobs, clerical jobs, certain manual occupations, certain kinds of manual labor, clerical, administrative, secretarial work. And that's actually developed a lot more detail in this section. And then the writer then also makes some theoretical distinctions between different types of sex segregation here when it comes to job roles, types of jobs that women go into. And then the next more detailed discussion of higher education. Women tend more towards humanities degrees, education-related majors, and things like that. And yes, more women are in things like business, law, and medicine, yet there are still certain tendencies for sex segregation in these fields. And in some ways, there hasn't been much change in, say, the US and other Western countries since the 1980s. And there are graphs and charts with fairly detailed figures and data to show this that are cited from other studies. And this would tend to maybe go along with certain theoretical explanations that were kind of maybe mentioned at the beginning of the paper. Next section, why do we see equalization in some indicators but not others? So here the writer is returning to these uneven trends more in, again, the skew in higher education and in, to begin with. So in this section, the writer is then going to try to talk about theoretical explanations. The writer is a sociologist, and in sociology, like in other social sciences, you're interested in theoretical explanations. What are explanations for the general increase in equality, egalitarian treatment of women, to begin with? And again, the writer considers some different explanations for the egalitarian progress, but the unequal trends. When you look at a finer level, these gender disparities that still exist when it comes to their choices of careers and higher education majors and such. So on page 364, the writer says, not all forms of gender equality are consistent with liberal egalitarian values. So kind of the liberal egalitarian values in Western countries that are liberal beliefs in human rights, human equality, democracy, and things like that. Because, well, in a sense, women maybe are choosing these certain careers. They may be preferring some of these careers and choices, which in a sense is not necessarily at odds with liberal democratic values, but it's still maybe not so desirable. And as the writer says, many gender scholars who study this, we'll talk about the cultural force of stereotypes, that there are still strong stereotypes about gender roles and what kinds of roles are better for women, and these could have still a powerful effect. So the writer is basically bringing up sociological explanations, and the writer cites a lot of sources for scholars who talk about this and some of the evidence for this, in the different ways that gender stereotypes can still have an influence and lead to this sort of segregation in, institutions like education and labor workforce and such, and cites a lot of sociological data and studies and explanations about the effects of these stereotypes. Next section on 365, the writer then looks at more about sociological theories and how they might explain these outcomes, these results. So different theoretical explanations. So the writer is contrasting and comparing different theoretical views. So we talked about sort of the inductive, or rather the inferencing approach, where you consider maybe two or more different possible explanations and think about which one is better, and you conclude maybe this is the best explanation. The writer here is going to do that, is going to look at maybe a couple of different theoretical models or theories and how they may explain all of these complex trends. Now, the writer is not really going to decisively say it's this one. The writer's kind of critiquing, two different theories and models and what they might say, and talks about the strengths and weaknesses of these different models or theories in terms of how they explain these differences or disparities. One is a sort of affluence as societies become more affluent, that is wealthy and such, more and more women can afford to choose some of these careers. So like certain women who may be affluent or have affluent families, they can sort of afford to go into certain careers like teaching or education, humanities related fields, service fields or such. So it's sort of a personal choice that because women can afford it, they can go into certain careers that are maybe not as high paying and such. They can kind of, to so to speak, indulge in these stereotypically female fields because they can afford it. I can afford to be a teacher. I can afford to be a service worker. I can afford to be a secretary because we're not, our family isn't poor. Something like that. That's kind of oversimplifying it. And then that's more of an individual choice explanation. And the writer goes into kind of evidence for and against that kind of explanation. Then other kinds of possibilities are contrasted and compared. Stereotype influences and other things, and that's kind of, the writer seems to lean more into that sort of individual choice kind of explanation. I don't feel like it's really explained to me, it's not explained specifically enough or persuasively enough. It's an interesting kind of perspective. I think it might explain, I don't know, my impression is it might explain some of the inequality. I'm not sure if that's enough of an explanation, but okay, it's an interesting point. That's kind of what the writer's trying to get at. Then there is a long conclusion section on 366, which is really more like a general discussion section. It says conclusion, but it's a long conclusion. It's more like a general discussion. So again, the writer kind of summarizes some of the main points. Access to labor markets and education systems, good, it's better. Still, sex segregation within these fields, maybe not so good. Equality doesn't appear in, where we would expect it. Some of these inequalities in terms of, women going more into certain stereotypical female fields seems to appear more in, as the data indicate, in countries that are maybe the most progressive. Think of, Northern European countries that are known for being progressive on equality. Yet you still have these, for example, labor inequalities, career inequalities, or differences. And here the writer then goes more into comparing the different explanations, sociological explanations, traditional modernization theory that equality should be greater in advanced societies, in such, versus maybe another kind of sociological theory that understands egalitarian change or equality as kind of a global social phenomenon that will over time lead to more equality over time, as over time stereotypes decline and women have even more kind of power and opportunity. And then the writer kind of assesses the predictions of these two different theoretical views here in this section, and what they might mean for the future. And then the writer adds another point about the role of governments in promoting gender equality on 367. Okay, 367, the writer goes more specifically into the future. What does the future hold? And the writer kind of, in theoretical terms, kind of talks about likely future trends. Either this is going to continue, this kind of inequality is going to continue in different occupations, and occupation choice, or over time, social attitudes will change and this inequality will over time disappear as social attitudes change more, albeit slowly, and such. So then the writer concludes by saying sociologists need to distinguish between different types of inequality in terms of access versus the segregation within certain domains, like women choosing more stereotypically female majors in higher education, or stereotypically female jobs, careers. So sociologists, as the writer points out, need to distinguish between different types of gender inequality here. You can't just talk about inequality in general. You need to distinguish between access. Do women have equal access to higher education and jobs, careers, and such? And are women equal in terms of the distribution of women in different majors and types of careers? There are different kinds of sexual inequality. And that's the conclusion. And then you have the references section where all the all the cited sources are listed here. It's a lot. This is a review article, and so the writer cited a lot of sources, a lot of empirical studies, a lot of qualitative and quantitative studies by other sociologists, economists, research data from government agencies and NGOs like OECD and the United States government, and so on. So all throughout, sources are cited. Of course, the writer is citing a lot of research studies to show these trends of women's equality and inequality in all these different fields: education, household work, job markets, advancement in the workforce, and such, as well as sources about different theoretical explanations, different models, possible outcomes, what the future might hold. All throughout the paper, sources are cited in order to support the various points that she makes, the various differing ideas or possible explanations she considers. Sources are always cited, they're constantly cited in order to help explain different ideas that she is contrasting and comparing, the different possible explanations for all these complex social phenomena. And as you look at the sources, the way that they are listed in the citation, the references section, it sort of looks like the APA system. So the APA is a system that is used in papers in psychology, education, many fields of linguistics, language education research, applied linguistics research. This one looks a little different. There are little differences, and this looks to me more like a system that is like the APA, but it's used sometimes in sociology. It's called the ASA. So APA is American Psychological Association. ASA is American Sociological Association. So naturally, it's not surprising to me that sociology, this is from a journal called the Annual Review of Sociology. And so it's not surprising that they are maybe using the distinctive ASA format. So yes, some sociology papers do use APA. APA is just widely used throughout the world in psychology research, education research, many areas of linguistic research, especially applied linguistics, language education and such. Sometimes in business research and such, a lot of fields use APA. But this is more probably ASA. It's a little different from the APA. There are little differences that I noticed. Names of journals are abbreviated. There are no parentheses around the years like you see in the APA in the in references section at the end of the paper. The years are not highlighted with parentheses and other little differences like that I notice. But it is basically like APA. And the way that the citations are in the paper itself within the text looks similar to APA or kind of like APA citations or Chicago style citations. Okay, in the next video, I'll go more into a couple of other types of articles, applied linguistics, education research, and literature research. Okay, so I'll see you in the next video. Goodbye.